Okay, ladies and gentlemen, welcome to this webinar on lactose and lactose intolerance with the subtitle More Than Meets the Eye. This webinar is organized for you by the FrieslandCampina Institute. I hope that you will enjoy this webinar and that you will learn some new things about this complex topic. My name is Jan Geurts. I'm working as a principal scientist in the Nutritional Sciences Department of FrieslandCampina. I'm involved in several nutrition and health related projects, but lactose has my specific focus and attention. I'm situated in Wageningen in the building of FrieslandCampina Innovation, and we are a part of the university campus of Wageningen. Please be aware that the content of this webinar is not intended to be a substitute for any professional medical advice, diagnosis or treatment. So please always seek the advice of a physician or a medical professional with any questions you may have regarding lactose intolerance. So we have a lot to cover, so let's start. First of all, I would like to present you a table of contents for today's webinar. We'll start with some information on lactose, the unique milk sugar. So I will talk about the structure of lactose, about its qualities, about the dietary sources in which lactose is present, and the role of lactose during lactation, plus some information about lactose physiological benefits. After that, I will talk about the enzyme that digests lactose inside our bodies. It's called lactase, abbreviated LCT, also known as lactase fluorescein hydrolase with the abbreviation LPH. Then we'll shift gears and focus on lactase non-persistence and lactase persistence. I will give you some definitions. I will talk about causes, and I will talk about the prevalence of lactose maldigestion and lactose intolerance. Then we'll shift gears and focus in the second half of the webinar on lactose intolerance. I will give you various definitions, talk about lactose malabsorption tests. Then I'll switch to complexities associated with lactose intolerance, and I will finish off the webinar with some information on the management of lactose intolerance. At the end of the webinar, I will present you some conclusions. And at the very end, there will be some time for questions and answers. We received in total 28 very relevant and intriguing questions about this topic. And I urge you, if you have the time, to stay and listen in, because I think there's a lot of information there that ties in very nicely with what I will talk about in the upcoming webinar. So let's start. First of all, when we talk about lactose, of course, we are talking about milk, because lactose is the unique sugar present in milk. Milk is a unique feature of mammals. So if you look at the word mammal, it comes from mamma, the Latin word for breast. And mammals are characterized by the presence of mammary glands in which, in the female mammals, milk is produced that's used for feeding and nourishing the young. There are other distinguishing features that set mammals apart from other animals, like a neocortex, the presence of fur or hair, and 3 middle ear bones. In almost all mammalian milks, lactose is present as the principal milk sugar. This is, however, not always the case. There are examples like the sea otter or certain marsupials in which there is hardly any or no lactose at all present in the milk. There is, however, in every milk a carbohydrate source, but then it can be, for instance, the monosaccharide galactose that's present and or glucose, but not in the form of lactose. So what is lactose? Well, lactose is a disaccharide, and I show you on this slide some examples of disaccharides. You know about maltose, about sucrose. Maltose is the combination of 2 glucose moieties. Sucrose is the combination of glucose and fructose. And lactose is the combination of galactose and glucose. As I said before, lactose is the disaccharide that's exclusively present in the milk of most mammals. And it's present in a rather large amount. In cow's milk, it's 46 grams per liter. In humans, it's 70 grams per liter. So that's 7%. It's mainly used as an energy source. Disaccharides, sugars, have multiple other functions beside these physiological functions, and I present you in the lower left corner with some examples. Sugars can be used in the food industry as sweeteners, taste enhancers, fillers, gel formers, stabilizers, coloring agents, molecules that bring structure, or preservatives. So how does lactose look like? Well, here I show you the structural formula of lactose. As you can see in the left-hand side, you have the galactose moiety. It's coupled through a beta-1,4 glycosidic bond to a glucose moiety. And this bond, this beta-1,4 glycosidic bond, is an interesting one because it's rather restricted in nature. You see this bond in lactose. You see it in chitin, so the exoskeleton of insects, and you see it in cellulose, the major sugar of cell wall material. Lactose has been evolutionarily conserved in virtually all placental mammalian milks, but the concentration varies from species to species. Here I show you in this table the lactose content in several species. As you can see, going from seal to human, that the lactose content varies greatly between different species. The seal has hardly any lactose in its milk. It's mainly fat. If you look at goat, cow, sheep, it's around 4.3 to 4.8%. And if you look at the bottom of the table, you see human, which is 7 to 7.5% of lactose. Human has the highest amount of lactose currently known. There's one side remark I would like to make with this slide. I present you here the numbers, the lactose content that has been determined by lactose-specific methods. If you're going to look in old literature, very often the amount of lactose is exaggerated, and that's because the sugar content has been determined with a method that measures total carbohydrate content. So that's more than only lactose. So please be aware of that if you look into, let's say, the scientific literature before the 1970s. Here I show you various dietary sources of lactose. So dietary products can be grouped by lactose content. You have products that are low in lactose, you have products that are medium in lactose, and you have products that are high in lactose. So if you first turn to the group of products that are low in lactose, you can see that products like dark chocolate or butter, a lot of cheeses, for instance, also the mature hard cheeses like a Gouda cheese or a Camembert or ricotta, a Parmesan cheese, are all pretty low in lactose. And especially the Gouda cheeses are especially low in lactose because everything has been fermented by the lactic acid bacteria in those cheeses. Then if you look at the lactose containing products that have a lactose content of between 1 to 5 grams per 100 gram, you see a lot of the, let's say, dairy products like buttermilk, yogurt, skimmed milk, whole milk. These have typically lactose contents around 3, 4, 5 grams per 100 gram. On this slide, I show you on top the lactose containing products that have a high amount of lactose, for instance, ice cream or processed cheeses, 6 to 7 grams. And of course, the products that are the result of evaporation or drying are very high in lactose content, simply for the reason that the water has been taken out. So there you can see contents like 50.5 grams per 100 gram. In the lower panel, I show you a comparison of different milk products. You can see the cow's milk, for instance, has 4.8 grams per 100 gram of product. But also sheep's milk and goat's milk is quite high in lactose. It's still 4.2 and 4.7 grams per 100 gram. Sometimes these milks are put forward as good alternatives for people who are lactose intolerant, but that's simply not true. There is quite a lot of lactose in there. So let's turn to the specific properties of lactose. Lactose has very specific physical chemical properties, and lactose has many applications. And this is a kind of summary slide bringing together a lot of facts about lactose. So first of all, maybe it's interesting to know that lactose is quite exotic in nature. Besides milk, There have been reports that it was also found in forsythia flowers and in some tropical shrubs. That's a publication in 1949. But this has not been confirmed in later studies. So at the moment, the scientific consensus is that lactose is only present in milk. Lactose reduces sweetness and prevents discoloration of dried vegetables. Lactose is the main energy source for lactic acid bacteria in fermented dairy products, and its breakdown leads to the specific flavor compounds that we love and like, for instance, in yogurts and in cheeses. In concentrated and dry dairy products, the lactose concentration is so high that many of the properties of the product are determined by lactose. Lactose-enriched waste streams are applied in animal feed, and last but not least, lactose can be present or form the basis of several dairy-based ingredients. Examples are, for instance, pharmaceutical lactose, non-nutritive sweeteners like lactitol, and galacto-oligosaccharides, which are prebiotic fibers that enhance the gut microbiota in the colon after ingestion, and these are based on lactose. Then let's turn to the role that lactose plays during milk production and during breastfeeding. That's really interesting. Lactose has a very specific physical and chemical characteristic. Namely, it has low solubility. Lactose has 10% the solubility of sucrose at room temperature, but it has great stability. And stability means that it does not disintegrate in its monosaccharides, glucose and galactose. Sucrose, for instance, if you put that in solution, will spontaneously break up in those two monosaccharides, in the case of sucrose, glucose and fructose. But lactose doesn't do that. And that's giving two very clear benefits for milk production. One is because lactose stays whole, it cannot diffuse out of the Golgi and secretory vesicles inside the mammary gland cells. In that way, lactose can be secreted into, let's say, what becomes the milk, and it will aid in drawing water into these organelles, and therefore lactose determines the volume of milk produced, not only in humans but also in all other mammals. There's a other benefit from the fact that lactose has low solubility and great stability, and that's that lactose enables the body to transfer significant amounts of energy to the neonate without excessive osmotic effects, because osmosis is determined by the number of particles, and since lactose does not disintegrate, it's one particle with the associated low osmotic pressure. But in the infant, it will give two sugars after digestion, glucose and galactose. So that's really interesting how nature selected lactose in that sense for these properties. Then turning to the beta-1,4 glycosidic linkage that I talked about when I showed you the structure of lactose. There is some scientific literature on the role of this specific linkage in breastfeeding. The idea is that because this specific linkage is quite unique in nature, that it may protect against infection by environmental microorganisms that cannot digest it. And if there would be another sugar or a polymer of sugar in breast milk, for instance a glucose polymer, all kinds of microorganisms from the environment could use that sugar as a substrate. And that could lead to infections of the mammary gland, but it could also have implications for the shaping of the neonate's gut flora. Maybe now the neonate's gut flora is colonized by microorganisms that have a substrate specificity for this beta-1,4 glycosidic linkage that's present in lactose. Lactose also exerts various physiological roles in our bodies, and which for some of them they depend on the activity of the lactase enzyme in the small intestine, so lactase has to be digested. And like many milk constituents, it could serve several functions simultaneously. So first of all, lactase is an energy source, especially in lactose digesters, because they can take up all the calories that it brings in. Human milk contains around 7% lactose, as I told you before, and that provides up to 40–50% of an infant's energy needs. So it's an important energy source. Lactose is also the most important dietary source of galactose in the diet. Lactose has low sweetness. It has around 30% of the sweetness of sucrose. and it is free of reward effects. That was found by Professor Delavaux in 2002. He showed that if you digest and eat lactose, it does not cause the release of endorphins or dopamine in your body. Other sugars do. And there is some research now into this topic because, of course, this could be of interest for prevention of overweight or obesity later on in life. It's not clear if there is a real link there, but it's a topic of study. It has a low potential to induce dental caries. Lactose is the least cariogenic of fermentable sugars, and it's believed to be the least damaging. And especially if lactose is in the matrix of dairy, for instance in a cheese matrix where there are a lot of phosphopeptides, it seems to be really neutral to your dental surfaces. The lactose has a low glycemic index. The GI is 46. Probably the requirement for hydrolysis by lactase plays a role there, but low GI is of course associated with well-controlled glucose levels in your blood and increased metabolic health. Remarkably, higher consumption of lactose has also been found to be significantly associated with lower odds of depression. Then the last 2 points about lactose and its physiological benefits. First of all, lactose is special in the sense that galactose is in there. Galactose is a highly versatile monosaccharide because it gives the body the opportunity to do a couple of things with it, depending on what is needed. First of all, if there is an immediate energy need, galactose can be converted into glucose and can be used directly for energy production. Normally, under normal conditions, when galactose is flowing into the body simultaneously with glucose, that's a prerequisite, so glucose should be there, then lactose is converted to liver glycogen and acts as an energy reserve. This could of course be very interesting in between feedings to sustainably give energy to the infant in between meals. And third but not least, galactose can be used as a precursor in the body for a lot of glycosylated macromolecules. And these glycosylated macromolecules play a role in the immune system, also in the nervous system. Galactose, for instance, is the basic building block for galactocerebrosides. And these are the building blocks for myelin, or the white matter in the nervous system. So these are important functions. Last but not least, the gut microbiota modulating effects of lactose. In case that there is excess of lactose that is not digested by the host, can be due to a temporarily high lactose ingestion, and there is just overflow of lactose into the lower end of the GI tract. Or there is low or absent lactase activity. That can be due to either genetics or disease or immaturity. Then lactose can be transferred to the lower part of the intestine, where it is metabolized by bacteria. And then we come to the topic, because the bacterial metabolites that are then produced can go in two directions. Either it's a nice production of short-chain fatty acids and there are not too many gases produced, and then it delivers benefits to the host. Or you have a gut microbiota that is stimulated, that has a lot of gas-producing bacteria in there, and then you get a lot of gas produced, you get bloating, and you get complaints. So the entry of lactose in the lower part of the GI tract can be prebiotic-like, let's say beneficial, but can also be adverse, and that's very complex. There are a lot of factors that come into play in understanding what will really be going on. But we'll come back to that at the end of the webinar, where we talk in more detail on lactose intolerance. Interestingly, multiple observations have been made that show that lactose consumption results in gut microbial adaptation, so shifts in the species of microorganisms in lactose intolerant persons, resulting in improvement of symptoms. So apparently, if you have a low threshold intake of lactose that does not give complaints, it will shape your microflora and will steer it in the direction of microorganisms that can help you become a little bit more tolerant. If you're a severe lactose intolerant person, it will not alleviate all your symptoms, of course, but it will help. And there's one last point I would like to make, that's that lactose is per definition not a prebiotic. So because it does not fit any of the accepted definitions by Codex Alimentarius, EFSA, FDA, etc. So please do not talk about lactose as prebiotic. If you talk about lactose in terms of gut microbiota modulating effects, call it gut microbiota modulating effects. So we shift gears and are going to address the enzyme that breaks down lactose in the body, and that's called lactase or lactase fluorescein hydrolase. This enzyme is present on the so-called brush border of the enterocytes in the small intestine, because that's of course the area of the small intestine that comes into contact with food. And I show you in the right panel and top a staining of lactase on the villi of the mucosa, and there you can see in brown the lactase. Then on the left-hand side of the slide, I show you a depiction of the lactase enzyme. So what you can see, it's anchored in the cell membranes of the enterocytes at the luminal site. And the enzyme has multiple domains. The domains that have the indication here with the Roman number 4 are the ones that in fact digest, hydrolyze the lactose into glucose and galactose. And on the right hand side, but in the panel at the bottom, I show you the expression of lactase in the small intestine. What you can see is there is expression in the duodenum, in the jejunum, and the ileum, but the highest expression is in the jejunum, so in the mid part of the small intestine. So what does lactase do? Well, if lactose comes into the lumen, lactase will detect it, lactose will bind to lactase, and lactose will be split in galactose and glucose. And glucose and galactose will be taken up. At the luminal site, there is a transporter for that called SGLT1. And glucose and galactose are both transported by this same transporter. Then at the basolateral side of the enterocyte, glucose and galactose again will be transported to the bloodstream by the same transporter, which is GLUT2. Then we're going to talk about lactase non-persistence and lactase persistence, because the lactase enzyme is normally expressed in infants and young children up to a certain age. I will show you in a slide a little bit more detail about it. But for a lot of people, lactase will be switched down. So lactase activity will go down. That's genetic downregulation of the lactase gene and thereby the lactase protein. And that happens in the majority of mammals and also in the majority of humans, in approximately 65% of humans. That means that in 65% of humans, the ancestral situation is a 90 to 95% decrease in lactase production in the years after weaning, and this is called lactase non-persistence. So lactase non-persistent individuals become lactase malabsorbers because they don't produce a lot of the lactase enzyme anymore. And these people can suffer from lactose intolerance complaints after consuming milk and dairy products when they are adults or older. Please be aware that not everyone with lactose malabsorption develops symptoms of lactose intolerance. Not everybody. So when is lactase switched down? Well, the interesting thing is that that varies across the globe. It's dependent on the specific population you're looking at. I would say that on average, you could say that most children under the age of 5 will probably have quite a good lactase expression. And children older than 5 and adults can have reduced lactase expression in this group of 65% of humanity. And in this table, I show you that, for instance, in Chinese children, lactase downregulation is somewhere between the age of 1 to 5 years old. But there are also studies that show children of 7 to 8 years old. In Japan, it's 1 to 5. But for instance, if you go down in the table to Mexico, you see that's 4 to 13. So there's a bigger spread. In Israel, the Jewish population in Israel, for instance, it's from 6.5 years onward. So it varies. Downregulation of lactose production leads to lactose maldigestion, and I show you here the world prevalence of lactose maldigestion. Please be aware that lactose maldigestion is in fact what is measured by the techniques for detecting lactose intolerance. In fact, you measure with a lactose a hydrogen breath test or with a glucose tolerance test, you measure lactose maldigestion. So this is pretty accurate. This map is pretty accurate. And what you can see is that Western and Northern Europe and some hotspots in Africa have very low numbers of lactose non-persistence. You see that other parts of Africa and parts of Asia have high prevalence of lactose non-persistence, and that the countries that are in fact have links, let's say, from history to European populations, like the USA or Canada or Australia, they are a little bit in between. So they have moderate levels of lactase non-persistence. This is a difficult slide to read, but I put it on because you can always look at it in the film that will be produced from this and focus on it. But I show you here on this slide in different regions of the world for different countries what the exact numbers are for LMP. And yeah, just looking at Europe, for instance, that's the top right panel. You can see that, for instance, in Armenia, 98% of the population is lactase non-persistent. On the other hand, if you go down on that panel to Sweden, you see that it's like 6%. So there are huge differences per continent in the regional prevalence of lactose maldigestion. Then the estimated lactose intolerance frequencies, and I bolded here the word estimated because there is no objective assessment possible of this. I mean, it's always more difficult to measure or objectively assess lactose intolerance than lactose maldigestion. And I think on average, the frequency of lactose intolerance is 3 to 5 times lower than the prevalence of lactase non-persistence. That's a bit of rule of thumb. And you can see here on the map a bit the same picture as for the lactose maldigestion. You see that in Europe and in Northern America and Australia, the prevalence of lactose intolerance is quite low, and for the Netherlands it's 2 to 3%, while the rest of the world is much higher, and especially in Asia the numbers are quite high. So that was lactase non-persistent. So 65% of humanity is lactase non-persistent. Then there are 35% of humanity that's lactase persistent. Of course, interesting. How is that possible? How can it be that 35% of humanity is able to persistently consume lactose into adulthood without any problems? And the situation is known as being lactase persistence. Well, that has to do with genetics, because the trait of lactase persistence is the result of genetic changes. And on this slide, I show you one of these genetic changes. This is the most frequent genetic change in Europe. These genetic changes occurred 5,000 to 8,000 years ago. The idea is that it happened, the first genetic change leading to lactase persistence probably happened somewhere in what is now known as the Eastern Europe. So in the region of Poland, or maybe a little bit more to the east. It's a single nucleotide polymorphism that is located 13,910 base pairs away from the actual lactase gene. But this change in DNA base pair, in which a CG base pair is replaced by a TE base pair, prevents the DNA in that position from being methylated. And that methylation normally makes sure that the gene is shut down. But when you have this single nucleotide polymorphism, methylation is blocked, and so the lactase gene stays active lifelong. And the SMP that I show you here is typically found in Europe and in the Northern American and Australian populations. But there are more. There are at least 4 other SMPs described in other populations that also give rise to lactase persistence. So that's interesting. It means that in different populations, lactase persistence arose multiple times independent of each other. And that's what's called coevolution or convergent evolution. It's a sign that there's a very strong selection to develop this trait. On this slide, I show you the different SMPs and their distribution in different parts of the world. In Europe, you see the minus 13,910 SMP, and you see that almost 3/4 of the European population is a carrier of this SMP. In Asia, most of the people are non-persistent, but this population is, this SMP is also present in a smaller part of the population there. That has probably to do historically with the silk trading route, in which there was genetic material exchange between European traders and people, locals living in Asia. And then in Africa, as very often is the case, you have the most diverse situation. There are a lot of SMPs present there in different regions. There are also unique SMPs there that are not encountered in the rest of the world. And the situation in Africa is really very special and very unique in that sense. There are a lot of very interesting stories to tell about that, but unfortunately I don't have the time to do it now. But if you're interested, then send me a mail and I would be very happy to talk about it. So the fact that lactase persistence has been co-evolved in different places of the world around the same period in time suggests that it has been under extremely strong natural selection. And also the ability to digest lactose lifelong has spread incredibly fast in European populations, but also in African populations. It has been estimated by genetic modeling that 5 to 10% more persons with this genetic variant survived to reproductive age each generation. And that makes lactase persistence the strongest positive selected genetic trait currently known. Being able to digest lactose into adulthood was probably the biggest health advantage of the last 7,000 years. And this is not something that I quote myself, but I took this from a Nature publication that came out a couple of years, because people are really surprised how strong the genetic selection has been on this trait. What could be the drivers for this? I'll just give you a couple of hypotheses. There are much more. One thing could be if you're lactase persistent, you can digest lactose lifelong, and that's a great benefit because lactose is a great source of energy. The other thing could be, now it's not specifically about lactose, but if you can drink and eat lactose containing dairy products, then you're guaranteed with a steady supply of nutrients, high quality proteins, fat, vitamins, but also water. So please also think about rehydration, which could have been very important in those days. And it's a dependable food source despite cold weather or bad crops, etc. Another modeling attempt showed that Neolithic women who could digest milk were estimated to produce 32% more offspring because they just had this access to this great energy source. And last but not least, milk is a very efficient protein source. It does not require your livestock. Yet the milk that comes from one cow nearly equals the caloric value of the meat from a whole cow. So that's of course an interesting thought. You had your herd with you, and you had a constant supply of high quality protein. And maybe it's a combination of these things, and there are many more thoughts about this. So let's now go to the second part of this webinar, and that's lactose intolerance. So lactose intolerance is characterized by various symptoms. First of all, lactose intolerance is of course the result of undigested lactose passing into the large intestine, and that's known as the process of lactose maldigestion or malabsorption, and it can trigger symptoms of lactose intolerance. But this depends on several factors. First of all, the symptoms can vary in degree of severity depending on the amount of lactose that you ingest, whether or not it's consumed as part of a meal. It's dependent on the temperature of the food. There are a lot of factors that come into play in knowing what's going to happen. What are the signs of lactose intolerance? That's abdominal pain, it's bloating, it's flatness, diarrhea, belly noise, nausea, vomiting, and constipation. So lactose intolerance complaints are very much centered around the GI tract. It's good to understand that lactose intolerance clearly overlaps with irritable bowel syndrome. That's also something that could lead to mix-ups with the symptoms that patients come into the clinic with. So if you look at the official Rome 4 criteria for IBS, then IBS is defined as recurrent abdominal pain, on average at least 1 day per week in the last 3 months, associated with 2 or more defecation associated criteria. So changes in the frequency of stool or changes in the appearance of stool. And of course, looking at this definition, you can already see that there will be overlap with symptoms of lactose intolerance. So always be aware that these things could overlap, and be sure that if you diagnose lactose intolerance, that it's also really lactose intolerance. And for that, you need to turn to the lactose maldigestion methodologies that I will discuss later on. So what's the pathophysiology of lactose intolerance? I try to summarize it here in one picture. First of all, one remark: lactose intolerance is not a form of allergy. It's a form of a food hypersensitivity. If food allergy is an immunological reaction. So there are immunoglobulins, for instance, produced like IgEs or IgGs, or there is a clear immunological component. This is not the case for lactose intolerance. Lactose intolerance is an hypersensitivity, like you can have a hypersensitivity for fructose or for preservatives, etc. So on the left side of this panel, I show you what happens with normal lactose digestion. So lactose enters your GI tract, comes into the small intestine, encounters the lactase enzyme, it's split in glucose and galactose, and both monosaccharides are taken up in the body. If you're lactose intolerant, lactose comes into your small intestine. There is no or hardly any lactase there, so lactose is not split. Lactose is osmotically active, so it will attract water. You will get water influx into your gut. This will contribute to diarrhea. And lactose will travel down the GI tract and end up in the terminal ileum or in the colon. There are bacteria that will ferment the lactose. And lactose can be fermented by bacteria that will produce certain acids or gases. And these can lead to irritation. And in combination with the water and the diarrhea, this explains the complaints that people with lactose intolerance will end up with. So this is a very complicated slide, but I think it's very good to go over this, because what I try to summarize here is all the different concepts and interrelationship between the concepts that come into play when you talk about lactose intolerance. So first of all, let's focus here on a healthy adult. So as an adult, you can be either lactase persistent, or you can be lactase non-persistent, as I explained in the previous slides. So what was lactase persistent? Well, lactase persistence is a dominant genetic trait that is usually associated with continued high levels of lactase production into adulthood. And as I showed you, there are 5 genetic variants associated with that. Or you are lactase non-persistent. What was lactase non-persistence? Well, that was the recessive and ancestral genetic trait, 65% of humanity, associated with a decline in intestinal lactase to less than 2 units per gram of tissue in the intestine that kicks in sometimes between the end of weaning and adulthood, and it was variable depending on the population. So as an adult, you're either LP or you're LMP. So let's first talk about the situation of the LMP. So if you're LMP, you are per definition not producing any lactase. There is no lactase expressed because that's the definition of LMP. That means that you're lactase deficient. And that's another definition that I want to bring in. That's the LD that you can see here. So lactase deficiency is the reduction of intestinal lactase enzyme from any cause, either genetic, like with the LMP persons, or any other secondary cause, like diseases or injury of the small intestinal bowel mucosa. For somebody who is LP, in normal conditions, of course, lactase expression will be unaffected, so lactase will be there, it will be produced. If lactase is produced, yeah, okay, you're in this green box. But be aware, there are also people that are genetically LP but are still lactase deficient because there are secondary reasons for the absence of lactase enzyme in the gut. Can be because the gut of these people is temporarily damaged by an infection, or because they use certain medication that interfere, etc. So you see that the picture already becomes a little bit more complicated, because you cannot say that somebody who is genetically LP will be per definition somebody who will have no lactase deficiency. Let's continue one step lower. So we go back to the lactase non-persistence column. The lactase non-persistent people are lactase deficient, and so they will not be able to digest lactase. So they will be lactose maldigesters. What was lactose maldigestion? That's the inability to digest lactose for any reason, primarily because you're LMP, but also due to secondary causes. Most common tests for lactase deficiency or lactose intolerance are actually for lactose maldigestion. I'll show you in the next slide. Then we go to the column of the lactase persistent person. Somebody who produces lactase will be, on average, somebody who is not a lactase maldigester, but be aware, the subpopulation will be a lactase maldigester because of secondary causes, for instance, again, an infection, do not digest lactose in the gut. And then on the lowest level, we are talking about lactose intolerance. Well, what was lactose intolerance? That is when you have adverse symptoms resulting from ingestion of lactose, including flatus, gas, bloating, cramps, diarrhea, rarely vomiting. Please be aware, lactose intolerance may occur without lactose maldigestion. That's also described. But what you can see here, so we go first to this panel from the lactase persistent people. So somebody who is genetically lactase persistent will probably produce lactase, will probably be able to digest and absorb lactose, and will be lactose tolerant. But there is one complicating factor, and that is when you look into the LMP column. Somebody who is LMP will probably be LD, so lactase deficient, will probably be LM, so lactose maldigester, will probably show signs of LI, so lactose intolerance. But a small proportion will not notice that they are LMP because they are in fact behaving as lactose tolerant. How is that possible? Because in these individuals there is colonic microbiota adaptation that ameliorates their symptoms. So they don't notice the fact that they are in fact LMP. They don't produce any lactase. And they are still capable with their intake of lactose, which is probably quite low. They don't have any symptoms at all. And the microbiota can help out in that. I hope that that's clear. It takes a while to really get this scheme internalized because there's a lot of information in there. But I think it's very helpful if you are dealing with lactose intolerance to know these differences. It's even more complex because there are two additional definitions. One is something that for people who are working with lactose intolerance in a clinical setting will be something that they will be confronted with. That's the so-called self-reported lactose intolerance. that are persons that believe themselves to be lactose intolerant, but have never been tested for lactose maldigestion. Please be aware that if you didn't do the objective test, you don't know for sure that they are lactose intolerant. And then you have the term lactose sensitivity. That has to do with more the systemic symptoms. So if you don't only have the GI symptoms of lactose intolerance, but you also have more systemic symptoms like depression, headache, fatigue, etc., then we're talking about lactose sensitivity. And lactose sensitivity has a big overlap with IBS. So there are also different forms of lactose intolerance. Lactose intolerance can be classified into 4 groups. You have the so-called congenital lactose intolerance, that's also known as alactasia. That's an extremely rare autosomal recessive condition. That's one in, I think, 40 or 50,000 infants. That's caused by mutations in the lactase gene, leading to insufficient lactase levels in the small intestine. Children with this affliction usually fail to thrive. You have neonatal lactase intolerance. That's insufficient levels of lactase present in the small intestine related to the gestational age of the neonate. Then you have primary adult onset hypolactasia. That's in fact the LMP. Primary means genetic, equals to LMP. That can also occur, by the way, in older LP individuals. So when you age, you become a little bit less epi-LP. You become a little bit more prone to lactose intolerant complaints. And then you have the secondary adult onset hypolactasia that's acquired and very often very reversible, that can occur at any age and is the most common cause of LI in children under the age of 5. So it occurs because of diseases, infection, medication, of surgery, because that can damage the integrity of the villi. Several tests for measuring lactose maldigestion. I will not go over all the details because it simply will take me too much time, but I will tell you that there are 2 groups of tests. First of all, you have the direct tests. In fact, that's very often just taking a biopsy and measuring lactase activity in the biopsy. And then the criterion is that normal expression of lactase should be 18.3 units per gram of tissue or more. And if it's less than 10, then you are lactase, not expressing enough lactase. Then there are the indirect measurements, and that's what used the most in the clinic. That's the blood glucose test, also known as the lactose tolerance test. So there you ingest a bolus of lactose, normally 20 to 50 grams, and you measure blood glucose every 30 minutes for 2 hours. And then if blood glucose rises above 1.1 to 1.4 millimoles per liter, then it's a clear sign that you're a lactose digester. Another test that's more or less the golden standard is the breath hydrogen test. So there again, you ingest a bolus of lactose and you measure hydrogen and methane gas in exhaled breath after this load. And you do that for 3 hours. And then lactose digesters are the ones that do not increase breath hydrogen above 20 ppm or methane about 10 ppm. And the other tests I will skip for now because it will take me too much time to go into these details. So then let's turn to the complexity with lactose intolerance. There are many complexities, and I try to summarize them here for you on these sheets. So first of all, the lactose maldigestion can yield false positive test results. Why? Because single large doses or supra-threshold doses of lactose can generate lactose maldigestion positive test results and induce lactose intolerance symptoms in LMP, but also in LP individuals. Because 50 grams is quite a big amount, also for people who are LP. It can be overwhelming. So please be aware of this. Another thing that can intervene in these measurements is what's called SIBO or SIBO, small intestine bacterial overgrowth, something that you see, for instance, after bariatric surgery or in aging. And this presence of these bacteria in the small intestine can interfere with the interpretation of test results. So it's a very good method, but please be aware of these possible restrictions, let's say, to the interpretation. Another complexity has to do with pregnancy. If a pregnant woman enters your clinic who is lactose intolerant, then please be aware that pregnancy is a condition where lactose tolerance can be improved by the pregnancy in LMP individuals. How is that possible? Because progesterone production, and progesterone as a hormone will retard intestinal transit times, where it will slow it down. And then lactose enters the small intestine at a much lower pace. It will be much easier to handle for the small amount of lactase that an LMP woman has. So this can be an underestimation of her lactose intolerance symptoms. Another thing that can happen with pregnancy is colonic microbiota adaptation. When the pregnant woman is continually consuming lactose, it can lead to colonic microbiota adaptation that can ameliorate lactose intolerant symptoms. Medication can interfere. Various medications can influence the transit times and/or the water absorption and thereby affect symptoms of lactose intolerance. One of the examples is, for instance, loperamide, which is a form of medication that slows intestinal transit time. And because of the low lactose content of most drugs, there is no evidence that the lactose on itself of, let's say, these tablets, for instance, causes symptoms, even when multiple capsules are taken in one dose. So most studies define let's say 5 to 6 grams of lactose as the threshold amount for eliciting hydrogen production that you can pick up with a breath hydrogen test. And you need 10 to 50 grams for the start of symptoms on average. Health or disease matters, a little bit more complex slide, but diseases, illnesses can affect intestinal motility and integrity of the mucosa. For instance, I give you a couple of examples. I'll start on the left-hand side of this slide with daily living stresses and psychological factors such as depression, anxiety may contribute to lactose intolerance via microbiota. Hyperthyroidism can aggravate symptoms of LI. Since many disorders are associated with alterations of the microbiome, lactose digestion in LMP individuals may modify the severity of symptoms. There are a couple of diseases that affect the villi of the small intestine, reducing lactose levels. For instance, celiac disease, infections, either viral, bacterial, or parasitic, radiation therapy, surgery, medication. Symptoms of lactose intolerance can be caused by lactose and other carbohydrates, as well as by other diseases like IBD. By gynecological neoplasms, neuroendocrine tumors, bacterial overgrowth. These conditions can be diagnosed relatively easily. However, the most common disorders that can be confused with lactose intolerance are the so-called functional gastrointestinal disorders like IBS. So please be aware that there are a lot of complicating factors there if you are dealing with patients. Food matters. The type of food eaten with lactose can reduce the rate at which lactose reaches the lower intestine. For instance, fat content. High fat content in products delays gastric emptying and in that sense ameliorates symptoms. A regular consumption of lactose in foods can improve lactose intolerant symptoms in lactose naive individuals because it adapts, it shapes the microbiota. Undigested lactose alters the microbiota, and it is possible that systemic features that are attributed to lactose intolerant could be expressed via the microbiome complicity and associated microbial host neuron interactions. So food and microbiota matters. I want to finish off the complexities with this slide. This has nothing to do with science, but it has a lot to do with what is said in the media and social media about lactose intolerance. There are a lot of misconceptions there, and lactose intolerance has captured the imagination of the general public, and many dairy and non-dairy related gastrointestinal symptoms are erroneously attributed to lactose without the proper clinical investigation, for instance doing the lactose maldigestion tests. And I show you a couple of examples here. So please be aware of that. You really need to do the proper tests to be absolutely sure that we are dealing with lactose intolerance. So the last part of my presentation about management of lactose intolerance. So there are a couple of statements that I want to make here. Most lactose intolerant individuals were able to tolerate 12 to 15 grams of lactose in a single dose ingestion. That's on average. There are people that of course get complaints with 6 grams, and there are people that can tolerate 20 grams. It's recommended to consume acceptable quantities of lactose in single meal periods. So 1 cup of milk or 2 equivalents in divided doses. The consumption of low lactose products such as cheese or yogurt, or fermented dairy products such as kefir, or specifically produced reduced lactose milk can be very helpful. In fermented dairy products, the presence of the active lactic acid producing bacteria reduce the amount of lactose and help reduce, let's say, symptoms in lactose intolerant individuals. There are a number of lactase-based oral pills on the market that can be taken before consuming dairy products, and these, of course, deliver exogenous lactase to the body that can digest lactose and reduce or prevent gastrointestinal symptoms. Regular consumption of slightly higher doses of milk over several portions per day can increase tolerance by encouraging microbial adaptation. Bifidobacteria that respond to lactose don't produce that much, for instance, hydrogen gas. That's the reason why they can help ameliorate bloating symptoms, because they don't produce that. These are not the typical gas-producing microorganisms. Gluten restriction can be effective in the case of secondary hyperlactasia caused by celiac disease, allowing the return of lactase to the small intestine in the course of time when the intestinal villi are there again, because of course they get destroyed by the celiac disease. Then specifically something for lactose intolerance in children. Very often in children, if young children are lactose intolerant, then 99% of the cases is due to secondary causes such as gastroenteritis. In that case, restriction of lactose for a limited time is very useful, because you need to give the intestinal mucosa time to recover and the villi to recover. However, it's important to distinguish and rule out cow's milk allergy, because that's a completely different disease in which there's immunological reaction to protein. Because in those cases, if the child had cow's milk allergy, it doesn't make sense to take lactose out of the diet, because lactose is not the culprit in that situation. In the case of suspicion of IBS, restriction of foods containing FODMAPs, which are fermentable oligo-diamonosaccharides and polyols, can be very helpful, because then you can follow that by selective reintroduction of carbohydrates, including lactose, and see by the use of a specific diary to see when symptoms reoccur, and then you can tease out which carbohydrate gives the problems. Then lactose is treated as a FODMAP. So very short number of slides on FODMAPs. FODMAPs are fermentable oligosaccharide, disaccharides, monosaccharides, and polyols. Oligosaccharides, for instance, fructans, disaccharides, lactose is an example, also sucrose. Monosaccharides, for instance, fructose, polyols, for instance, sorbitol. FODMAPs increase small water influx into the small intestine, and so they can contribute, like lactose, to in the situation of lactose intolerance, to diarrhea. They also give rise to gas production, and I show you here in this diagram that especially if you're somebody with IBS and you have a diet high in FODMAPs, you produce quite a lot of gas. Getting FODMAPs out of your diet, if you don't know exactly what's going on, is a good idea. So I try to summarize on this slide the management of lactose intolerance in a scheme. Please be aware, this is not intended as some kind of clinical guideline. It's my attempt to summarize the insights that I had on how to handle lactose intolerance, try to guide you through. So somebody comes into the clinic with lactose intolerance complaints. First remark I want to make is please be aware with direct dairy avoidance, because dairy avoidance may lead to deficiencies in certain essential nutrients like calcium, protein, potassium, magnesium, selenium, B vitamins. Please be aware that dairy is an excellent source in the diet for these essential nutrients. And there are studies published, especially in the United States, where young girls, 13, 14-year-olds with self-reported lactose intolerance, for which later was proven that they were all lactase persistent, so they were wrong, kicked out the dairy out of the diet, and they all developed signs of osteoporosis at the age of 14 years old or 15 years old, because you need a lot of calcium at that age because of the growth you are going through. So it's not a good idea to do it, so please be aware of that. What you need to do is immediately test for lactase maldigestion, hydrogen breath tests, lactase tolerance tests, etc. There are two outcomes of that. Either you get a negative outcome, so the test says that somebody is not lactose maldigester. So in fact, the person is a lactose digester. What then could be the case is that somebody is not lactose intolerant, but for instance has IBS or something else. The advice would be go to a low FODMAP and low or gluten-free diet and do the elimination provocation protocol with the FODMAPs and see what comes out. If nothing comes out, yeah, then there is clearly another cause for the complaints, but then it certainly has nothing to do with lactose. If the lactose maldigestion test shows that the person is indeed a lactose maldigester, so probably an LMP person, and shows signs and symptoms and complaints during the tests, then there are a couple of things that you can do. First of all, you can follow nutritional approaches. For instance, you can try to lower the amount of lactose-containing dairy products, but try to find out what the individual tolerance of somebody is for dairy, for lactose-containing dairy. And on average, that could be 12 grams per day. So that's now not proportion, what I told you earlier in the presentation. That's what people normally can, on average, can handle. But here, of course, the people come in with complaints. So then on the safe side, you could try to let people consume 12 grams max per day. Optimally, split it up in 3 portions over the day and see if that helps. Another thing could be if you switch to dairy products that are normally well tolerated for people with lactose intolerant complaints, like fermented dairy products, cheese, yogurt. You could go for plant-based beverages, but be aware that they are not nutritionally equivalent to cow's milk. You could go to low products or lactose-free dairy products when the conventional milk or lactose-containing products are not tolerated at all. There are a couple of other options. First of all, you could look at probiotics and add them to the diet. Please be aware that at the moment, as far as I know, no contraindications, but there are also only a few slides that looked into this. You could also turn to prebiotics and then aim for adaptation of intestinal microbiota. Another thing is go for enzyme replacement. That's with the exogenous lactase, so the pills or the tablets that you can take. And you could go for a strategy of using antibiotics. And rilaciximab is an example. There is not a lot of evidence for that, so please be aware of that. Maybe you should look in the literature or talk to professionals that have experience with it to see what can be done. And of course, this can be successful, and then you had a successful management of lactose intolerance. If it fails, you're at the same point, of course, where you were with the FODMAP attempt, and then, yeah, there's a different cause for it. You cannot solve it with aiming at lactose intolerance. My conclusions. Lactose is a disaccharide of galactose glucose, likely exclusive to milk. Lactose has many specific physical chemical properties impacting the production process, and it's an important determinant of taste, quality, and properties of dairy products. It's one of the biggest pharmaceutical excipients. It plays an important role in lactation, has various physiological benefits. It's hydrolyzed by the enzyme lactase, that's expressed in the small intestine. In total, 65% of the world population decreases lactase expression, with 90 to 95% in the years after weaning. The situation of lactase persistence, LP, is the ability to digest lactose, is the most strongly selected single gene trait currently known to science. It has evolved in Europeans and some African groups over the last 8,000 years, and around 35% of the world population is at the moment lactase persistent. Lactose contributes 40% of the caloric intake of newborns. Galactose has important roles in signaling and immune response, and is essential for brain development. Utilization of glucose and galactose ensures energy supply. Lactose intolerance is a difficult diagnosis to make, as there are many potential confounders. Yes or no experiencing lactose intolerance symptoms is depending on many factors. There are many complexities, as I showed you. Gastrointestinal symptoms certainly not always due to lactose intolerance. There are other causes for gut discomfort as well, and they should be looked into and excluded as well. There is, for instance, overlap between functional gastrointestinal disorders like IBS and food allergies like CMA. Lactose maldigestion, malabsorption does not necessarily lead to lactose intolerance. LNPs can still tolerate lactose in moderate amounts, on average 12 grams. Microbes matter. Excess lactose is metabolized by the microbiota, and lactose is per definition not a prebiotic, as it does not fit any of the accepted definitions. Lactose has the potential to be a conditional prebiotic in LNP individuals, but much more research is needed. Be aware of self-reported lactose intolerance. Lactose maldigestion tests should be carried out to confirm or dismiss lactose intolerance. Avoid unnecessary elimination of dairy products from the diet, as they are important sources of many essential nutrients, and elimination can lead to deficiencies. There are no universal accepted guidelines for lactose intolerance management. Management is complex. A strategy will depend on many factors. There are important points to consider. First of all, most individuals will tolerate some lactose. Gastric emptying time and gastrointestinal transit time are important determinants as well. Consuming lactose in the context of mixed meals generally decreases symptoms. In some cases, reduction of dairy product consumption is advised, but can lead to nutrient deficiencies like calcium deficiency. Gradual reintroduction of lactose and lactose-containing dairy products helps colonic microbiota adaptation. Ability to comply and patient choice should also be considered. Lactose intolerant symptoms overlap with IBS. Other dietary restrictions, for instance the low FODMAP elimination purification diet, can then be used and need to be ruled out so that LI can be ruled out. So I try to summarize here again lactose tolerance and lactose intolerance in a schematic. What you see here is the amount of lactase activity that you can have. So in the lower part you have most lactase activity, and here you have the least. The amount of lactose maldigestion that you can have. Here a lot of lactose maldigestion, here not a lot. And the amount of complaints that you can have. Here a lot of complaints, here not. So what can happen is that I am a LP person, but because I have an infection, I still have not too much lactase activity in my small intestine. So if I eat my normal amount of lactose, I will still have a considerable amount of lactose maldigestion, and I will still have complaints. So please be aware that there is substantial intra-individual variation caused by my genetic makeup and my LP or LMP, my gut microbiota composition and the metabolic activity of the gut microcomposition. Did I use recently medication or antibiotics? What is my pain tolerance for visceral pain? What is my chronological age, etc., etc.? This all results in different thresholds above which complaints, lactose intolerance occur, and below which lactose intake doesn't cause any problems. And with that, I'm at the end of this part of the webinar. I want to close off with, of course, thanking you all very much for your attention and for your endurance to stick with me for such a long amount of time. It was a lot of information, I'm aware of that, but I hope that having the details presented like this, that it will help you out. On this slide, you can also see the cover of a book that recently came out. It's a book dedicated to lactose, the evolutionary role, the health effects, and the applications. Two colleagues of mine were editors. I can strongly advise you to buy this book and read it if you want to learn more about lactose. It's from Academic Press, from Elsevier. You can order it online. It's a great book. There's a lot of information on lactose in there. And if people are still willing to spare 15 minutes or 20 minutes, then I will now go to the question and answer session. I think it's really worthwhile to stick around because a lot of the things that I discussed were also asked. And I try to bring that together, let's say, in my answers to the questions. So I will now go to the first questions. It's small print, sorry, but I will just go over it and guide you through. So the first question was, are there any telltale signs that you're dealing with a lactose problem instead of a milk allergy or a sensitivity problem? Okay, the great question. First of all, lactose intolerance is not a form of allergy, but it's a non-allergic food hypersensitivity. It's like the intolerance to fructose or food coloring agents or additives or preservatives. Food allergies arise through an immunological reaction to certain allergens in food. These allergens are almost always proteins. Milk allergy is therefore called CMPA, cow's milk protein allergy. Diagnosis of lactose intolerance and cow's milk protein allergy are a real challenge, both. While lactose intolerance is characterized by predominantly the gastrointestinal complaints that I talked about, like abdominal pain and the bloating, etc., the non-specific signs and symptoms of cow's milk protein allergy range from colic and reflux to constipation, so that's also gastrointestinal complaints, but also other complaints like insomnia, eczema, diarrhea, crying. The symptoms of CMPA involve many different organ systems, predominantly the skin. 75% of patients with cow's milk allergy have skin problems like eczema. And they have, besides the gastrointestinal symptoms, also respiratory tract involvement. So the involvement of two or more organ systems increase the likelihood of CMPA. So differentiating LI from CMPA can be challenging, especially if in both disorders the gastrointestinal complaints dominate. But please be aware, normally in CMPA you see more organ systems involved. For instance, 70% of infected infants have skin-related symptoms. Lactose intolerance is very rare in infants younger than 5 years of age, even in those with CMPA. So as lactose inhibits putrefactive bacteria and promotes the development of a healthy gut microbiota, please do not eliminate lactose from the diet of these children if they suffer from CMPA, because the lactose in there will help maintaining gut health. Second question. How is it possible that someone can get lactose intolerance by a gastric bypass operation on some different kind of bowel operation? That's through the loss of the introcyte villi that express the lactase enzyme. How long can a person build up adequate lactase after being diagnosed lactose intolerance? If somebody is genetically lactase non-persistent, so LMP, lactase production is significantly reduced and it cannot be reversed. It's lost lifelong. Continuous exposure to subthreshold levels of lactose can, however, shape the gut microbiota in such a way that more lactose can be handled. And that can increase a person's tolerance to lactose in dairy products. Your mileage, however, will vary from person to person and will depend on many factors, including the biological and chronological age of that person. I would like to ask, what kind of lactobacillus do we really need for the patient? Interesting question. What can we do with the probiotics? As I said before, the studies on probiotics are not that plentiful. So please look into this topic yourself to dig out the most recent insights. A general remark that I would like to make is that lactic acid bacteria used in dairy fermentation, so yogurt and cheese, generally display high lactose utilization. Examples are, for instance, Streptococcus thermophilus, Lactococcus lactis, Lactobacillus casei, but there are many others. There's a very interesting review that came out very recently from Oak and Ja. Please look it up. And in this publication, they looked at the effectivity of all these bacterial strains for, let's say, lactose intolerance. And one species, Bifidobacterium animalis, seems to be particularly effective. So it would be very interesting to look into that, if that's the most effective probiotic at the moment. Question 5. I'd like to know more about increasing lactase levels action in those who become chronically lactose intolerant after gastroenteritis. Is there recommended lactose intake quantity and duration for introduction? Very interesting question. Generally put, a lactose restricted or lactose free diet forms the basis for management, and that can also be in the form of a FODMAP, low FODMAP diet. The degree of restriction, however, depends on the quantity of lactose that a person can tolerate, and that's for every individual different. Most people do not need to stop consuming milk or dairy products altogether, as most are capable of handling these 12 grams of lactose in a single dose, and that's equivalent to 250 ml of milk, so a big glass, or 12 grams during the course of a day. Some tips in case of severe lactose intolerant persons. Again, only restrict lactose if necessary. Start with complete lactose exclusion for 4 weeks. Monitor symptoms and then reintroduce lactose to tolerance levels, increasing it by 1 gram per day. And adjust the dose gradually over time until you know where the threshold for that person is. And then hopefully you have an optimum. Question 6. Is it possible for the body to reproduce enzyme lactase if one with lactose intolerance is being reintroduced to milk? No, because lactase expression is not inducible. Adaptation of the gut flora can help, as I said already a couple of times before. Is it possible to produce insufficient lactase as a newborn? Yes, but this is very, very rare. It happens in the case of congenital lactase deficiency or the alactasia that I was talking about, but that's even more rare, or in the case of GI tract infections. Normally at full-term birth, lactose is fully expressed. And to add a little bit more detail, lactase expression starts at 8 weeks of the gestational age, is more or less mature at week 36. Then after birth, with lactose expression, it really gets an extra boost, and within 4 or 5 days, 89% of lactose can be digested by 99% of the infants. Question 8, is a hydrogen breath test accurate after bariatric surgery? No, not per se. SIBO, so upper gut bacterial overgrowth, can interfere, and you have to be aware of that. Question 9, is lactose intolerance related to bacterial dysbiosis? And can intolerance reverse as the bowel situation improves? Not fully, but gut microbiota can play a modifying role. Lactose intolerance in Africa, are there differences between regions? And if so, why? Yes, as I showed you already on this chart, there are enormous differences in Africa. Africa is a very unique continent in this respect, and in many others, I think. And you see many differences. It mainly has to do with the presence or the absence of the LP gene polymorphism, the specific SMP that I was talking about in the various populations. And if this SMP didn't arise, yeah, then people are per definition LMP. There are many stories to tell about that. Again, if you're interested in it, just contact me afterwards and I will tell you a lot more about it. Question 11. What do you think of an IgG blood test, for instance, from ProHealth? First of all, food allergies are an autoimmune response, and food intolerance are often also called sensitivities, aren't. And we are talking with lactose intolerance about a intolerance. IgG may simply indicate that the food is in the diet. So that's the reason why IgG is there. But it's not indicative of, let's say, lactose intolerance. And we know that in children who outgrow a real allergic condition, let's say cow's milk allergy, IgG goes up and IgG goes down. So IgG is, in my opinion, absolutely irrelevant in the light of lactose intolerance. Let's see. Are the frail, anorexic elderly more lactose intolerant as they are age past 65 years and have poor gut health due to poor nutrition? Yes, and this is especially a problem as this vulnerable group is in great need of proper nutrition. Nutrient quality, but also quantity, but also quality. Think, for instance, about protein quality, the amount of well absorbable and digestible essential amino acids. That's of great importance. So loss of appetite is an additional complicating factor in this group. What do you think of intolerance in casein? Well, technically speaking, lactose and casein are simply components in milk. Someone who is allergic to casein and other milk proteins would not be allergic to lactose. Likewise, somebody who is lactose intolerant would not be intolerant to casein. They do not behave the same way in the body. If someone with hypolactasia removes lactose fully from the diet, does this reduce tolerance versus continuing to consume lactose to tolerance? Most probably yes, although lactose consumption does not re-induce lactase expression in the gut. Sub-threshold lactose consumption can modulate the gut microbiota, and this can help. Then an interesting question about a test that has been done with non-smoking pregnant women that had no diarrhea, but had a positive carbon monoxide test because they were tested for secret smoking. That was the reason that you can see in carbon monoxide levels. And can this be due to lactose intolerance? So does lactose intolerance occur without the diarrhea, and could it interfere with a test like this? Yes. Diarrhea is common, but it's not always present in lactose intolerant people. Symptoms depend on many factors, like the amount of lactose consumed and the amount of lactase that's still in the body of somebody who is lactase non-persistent. So yes, lactose intolerance can interfere with correct CO measurement when lactose intake is approximately 350 mL or more in a single dose. So you need quite a lot of intake for that. Let me see, I put this one in, but I think we will come to it with these questions. So first question 16, what must be done to increase tolerance to lactose? Well, there are many options. First, lower the amount of lactose intake per consumption moment, and that will increase your tolerance. 2, combine lactose intake with the intake of other nutrients, so mix meals. 3, continue to eat low amounts of lactose that give no complaints in order to shape your microbiota, and they can help. And 4, take lactase enzyme supplements by consuming a lactose-containing meal. 17, how will you treat secondary lactose intolerance as seen in conditions like celiac disease? Well, that's done with a low FODMAP and gluten-free diet. 18, what are some of the best ways to alter dairy intolerance for the long term? Continue it, sub-threshold amounts, shaping microbiota. That's, I think, the best way to do it. What percentage of adults around the world are lactose intolerant? 65. What are the differences in symptoms between lactose intolerance and cow's milk allergy? Next slide. I told you what the symptoms of lactose intolerance are. These are the symptoms of cow's milk protein allergy. So you see there are numerous digestive or gastrointestinal symptoms like dysphagia, reflux, abdominal pain, constipation, etc. There are respiratory symptoms, runny nose, wheezing, chronic cough, skin, urticaria, atopic eczema, rash. and general ones like shock-like symptoms, inconsolable crying, anaphylaxis, etc. What is your view on lactose drops, and if taken, what would be the most effective? What's a reputable lactase enzyme supplement for children and adults? Well, I said there are a number of lactase-based oral pills which can be taken before consuming dairy products to reduce or prevent the gastrointestinal symptoms. These lactase medications reduce breath hydrogen production and symptoms in LNP individuals because they provide exogenous lactase that keeps the lactose. Put here in a couple of publications, because I think please look into these publications yourself to pick out the best sources and suppliers, because I don't know what is the best supplier for these enzymes. These enzymes are usually derived from fungi or yeast. The quantity of lactase varies, but many contain from 1,000 to 3,000 units per tablet. And the number of tablets taken can vary depending on the consumer lactose load. The dose is taken normally 15 minutes before consumption, and the efficacy varies depending on quantity of lactose consumed. So most enzymes can pre-digest 20 grams on average of lactose, but efficacy is produced when higher lactose intakes, such as 50 grams of lactose, are taken in a single dose. Last questions. Secondary lactose intolerance can happen in children after an episode of viral gastroenteritis. Is it helpful if the child is given lactose-free formula or soy formula? Yes, that is absolutely helpful, but please only temporarily until the symptoms of the viral gastroenteritis have cleared. This way, the child does not develop deficiencies for the important essential nutrients of dairy. Does consuming lactose damage the gut? When a patient is lactose intolerant, a patient can feel really sick after eating or drinking lactose, and is the damage then temporarily? No, if lactose intolerance is the result of primary hypolactasia, so there's genetic downregulation, there's just not enough lactase, then current scientific work shows that it does not lead to any damage of the gut wall, probably because there's no inflammation going on. And one should always adopt, by the way, lactose intake to avoid complaints. But I think only in the case of secondary reasons, for instance, celiac disease or infections where there is real damage, yeah, sure, then there is damage, but not if it's primary hypolactasia. Can a patient regain lactose tolerance by drinking small amount of lactose? Yes, by shaping the microbiota. Why are more people being lactose intolerant? I think that science does not support that statement. I think that's not the case. Not with objective means, if you measure really lactose maldigestion. Maybe there is an increase in self-reported lactose intolerance. And I think that could be true because this topic is so hyped in the media, and especially the social media. But please do the test yourself. Measure with objective lactose maldigestion experiments if these people are LNP, and I will predict that they are not. Why do a lot of people from Suriname have lactose intolerance? Because they lack the genetic variation. So ethnicity, do you have predecessors that come from Europe, for instance, makes a big difference. Why should I recommend my clients to drink milk or use other milk products? Because milk and dairy products deliver many essential nutrients to the body, such as high quality proteins, vitamin B2 and calcium. There has been a conference on lactose intolerance in 2010 by the NIH, and the panel concluded then that the deficiency of nutrients in dairy food restricted diets was the most important detrimental consequence of lactose intolerance. So not damage to the gut, not other things, but really the deficiencies of nutrients. Avoiding dairy foods negatively affects bone health and possibly increases the risks of osteoporosis, as dairy foods are significant sources of dairy calcium. Moreover, the inclusion of dairy foods in the diet may also reduce the risks of hypertension, colorectal cancer, and possibly obesity and metabolic syndrome. I put the references in, please read for yourself. But please think about this point. Don't take dairy products too easily out of the diet. And then the last question, are lactase tablets useful in young children? Primary hypolactasia is very unlikely in this age group, so really genetic downregulation of lactose. So if lactase intolerance symptoms occur in this group, 99% chance that it is due to secondary hypolactasia. And in the case of secondary hypolactasia, you should treat the cause of secondary hypolactasia. So addition of exogenous lactose makes no sense to me, because in the overwhelming majority of these infants, they will produce enough lactase. So that's not the cause of their problems. And with that, I'm really at the end of the webinar. For the ones that are still here, thank you very much for staying so long with me. I hope you learned a couple of new things from this. Please feel free to contact me or the FrieslandCampina Institute in case you have any questions or remarks, or you need more information on a particular topic. I want to also thank the FrieslandCampina Institute for organizing this webinar, the technical assistance team that you don't see, but I do, because they are in my vicinity and making this a big success. And yeah, with that, I wish you a very nice day, and maybe we'll see each other in the future. Bye-bye.